Hi, and welcome to In the Flow with River. I am so glad you're joining me today. And we're going to continue our series and conversation around the victim triangle and understanding what it is, what the roles are, the role that trauma and shock play in it, and eventually leading to how do we get off of the triangle and living our life off of the triangle. So I just want to recap a couple of things. I want to remind you guys of what the victim triangle is. And what it is it's a way of interacting and relating that is dysfunctional in nature. There are three roles. I'm going to hold up my little sign here. We've got the victim, the rescuer, and the persecutor. And this entire dynamic and this way of relating is all centered around this idea of power. But there's a lot of other elements that are involved in it as well. And so I want to introduce you guys to some of them. So the role that trauma plays is a big one because in any dysfunctional family, there's trauma. And how it impacts a person and what it does to a person in their life can look differently for everyone. When I was a beginning therapist, I thought of trauma as being predominantly like physical or sexual abuse. I didn't think of trauma in the way that I do now. And so I want to introduce you to a deeper understanding of what trauma is. I remember one of my clients way back when was describing how when she was in third grade, she had dyslexia, and this was back in the 70s. And she got taken out of the class, put into a different class, a class for other students that had special needs. And because there was such a stigma back in the 70s, that was trauma inducing. She spent most of her life feeling like she wasn't very smart. She struggled to feel good about herself, even though she went on to become a doctor, a medical doctor. And she was always overriding this traumatic experience of I'm not smart enough and all these kinds of things. So let's start off with, what does trauma do to our brain? So trauma can be anything. And we can talk in future videos in depth about trauma, but this video still is focusing on the victim triangle. But when a traumatic event happens, the death of a parent, a divorce, abuse, verbal abuse, neglect, being teased, being alienated, not having friends in school, being ostracized, all of those can be trauma inducing. And what it is, it's like if you think about when you've been at the beach and you take your hand and you slam it into the sand and then you remove your hand. There's an imprint there. And to the subconscious mind does not differentiate the distinction between the imprint, right, or the traumatic event that led to it, right? There's no difference in the subconscious mind. So we know when a trauma is active because we'll get triggered by things that have structural similarity. In the subconscious mind, things that have structural similarity, the subconscious mind interprets it as the same. So I'll give you an example of my own. After last year I was burned in a fire very badly. And as I was healing and coming back into my life and re-entering into my life, I started going back to yoga. And I remember going to a yoga class to one of my dear friends who was teaching, and she went to do an adjustment on me, which is a normal thing. They'll come up and they'll do hands-on adjustments, and they feel great, and they're really wonderful to help you get deeper into the pose or more expansive. And she came up and she put her hands on my back, and I was actually in a pose called child's pose. Maybe many of you guys know that. And I freaked out. Like, I was like, don't touch me. I didn't want to be touched. I couldn't be hugged. I had a really strong reaction to being touched, and I'm a hugger, and so I didn't understand it, even though here I understand trauma, but it was literally the traumatic effect that was happening to me, and I was in it. So my subconscious mind was confusing being touched with some of the trauma that I experienced as a result of the fire and being in the hospital. So things that have structural similarity, the mind confuses as being the same. Maybe you guys have had that where you meet somebody and you instantly get a jolt of a strong reaction, one way or another, good or bad. It's most likely that your subconscious mind is picking up some similarities between that person and maybe someone else in your life, okay? So the role that trauma plays on the victim triangle is it keeps us stuck. In dysfunctional families, there is a lot of trauma. There's yelling, there's fighting, there can be abuse, there can be all of these different things. And so when you're dealing with somebody that's trying to heal from the victim triangle, we also need to look at what have been the traumas that individual has experienced, because unless they are healed, they're going to continue to get activated over and over and over and over. So, for example, in my experience of recovering from the fire, I remember saying specifically to my friend, like, she would ask me, is it okay to touch you? And I would say, yes, like, I need you to, so that I can get past this and you're a safe person, so that my mind could differentiate, like, this is not the same thing as having your wounds cleansed in the hospital, right? So trauma is an integral part. And so if you have a history of trauma in your background, okay, you need to work with a really good qualified trauma expert that knows how to repattern your mind and clean up that trauma. Because as long as the trauma is active, meaning the mind doesn't understand the difference between the handprint and the act that caused that, right? As long as that is active, you're going to still notice that you'll get triggered around the same things. And maybe some of you guys do. You'll go, why do I keep getting triggered and activated? Probably because there's a trauma there. So get some help around that and get support around that, because we can't heal that on our own. I specialize in trauma, and in as much as I knew how to control my mind while I was going through the fire and reorient my mind into present time, I couldn't do my own work. I had to still, work with my therapist on healing through that trauma. So trauma plays a very big role in it, because you have to know, in a dysfunctional family, there's lots of chaos and craziness, which is trauma inducing. Being yelled at repeatedly, being beaten or abused is traumatic. Being ignored is highly traumatic. Having a parent just completely ignoring you is very traumatic. So that can keep us stuck on the triangle, because then we are victims, right? So there's becoming a victim, or when we are victimized, and then there's the victim mentality on the triangle. So I hope that gives a little bit of insight into how trauma plays a part into that. And if there's questions that you guys have about anything related to trauma, anything related to what to do around that, please post those in the comments. I welcome the questions. I really want some engagement on this, and to talk about this. This is the stuff I'm really passionate about. So in addition to trauma, the other piece that happens is when we're traumatized, we go into shock. We go into that fight, flight, freeze response. And there's two different types of shock. There's parasympathetic and sympathetic shock. Parasympathetic shock looks like this. No, I'm fine. Everything's good. I'm good. I'm like doing my life and la 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 la, right? It's like that very animated, activated, just really hyped up experience. Sympathetic shock, it's more like where we get tired, we go to sleep, we can look very Zen-like. It can look like this, like, no, I'm totally okay, I'm fine. In fact, one of my teachers, he picked up on my shock response, because there was some stuff that was going on in a training that we were doing, and he looked at me and he said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Oh yeah, no, I'm fine." When the reality of it was, I was not. I was totally in shock, and I had basically left, right? So I looked all Zen-like, but I was in that fight, flight, freeze response. So we've got to get really attuned to treating shock. And you can start to notice when you're in shock, it's when you're in that state where you notice getting really activated and charged up, losing control, losing self-control and awareness of yourself or even your surroundings. Sometimes people, you can see they'll get like a little bit of a white ring around their mouth, because we're supposed to be running or fighting. So the shock response is something that's very common in trauma and in chaotic families. So chances are, if you grew up and you have recognized that victim triangle experience in your life, chances are you're dealing with shock. And a lot of us do get shocky. I mean, this is even a time now where people are just using the word triggered, where they get really activated when they see something. That's a shock response. So here's what's important to know about shock. Number one, shock is contagious. It's highly contagious. If you're around somebody that's in shock and you can recognize it, you're going to treat your own, response to that. And I'm going to talk about how to treat your response to that. The other thing too is that we can live in states of shock. For a long time in my life, I think I lived a lot of my life where I was in a state of shock. It's in a hyper arousal state where you're just, constantly vigilant of your environment and your surroundings, and your nervous system is just amped up. And it can literally become a way of being in the world. And if we think about it, we've probably all experienced that from time to time, or even see people that are always in shock. They're always stressed. They're always, worrying about something, oversleeping all the time if they're not at school or at work. So shock it's the nervous system response to thinking that a gun is pointed at our head or a dinosaur is chasing us. One of the things I say to my clients is being able to recognize when you're in shock. Ask yourself, do I have a gun pointed at my head, or is a dinosaur chasing me? Because that fight, flight, freeze response is to protect us from being safe. So as one of my teachers would say, our reptilian brain gets set off and is going off at times when it really shouldn't, okay? So how do you treat shock? Here's how we treat shock. First thing is an ice pack. We regularly have, I have ice packs in my freezer. I was gonna bring one out and I forgot to, but we'll put ice packs around our neck. And what it does is it helps you to get back into your body. Drinking water is really helpful for treating shock. Going in nature, going for a walk in nature, standing in your backyard barefoot, doing that earthing. They call it earthing. Back when I was a kid, we just called it running around in the grass. But you want to treat the shock. Essential oils, using an essential oil and pulling it out and smelling it. I don't have them right by me, but smelling it, and they call it a scent tent, where you put some essential oils. Grapefruit oil is a great oil for that. It's calming and relaxing. Lavender. But breathing it in, taking nice deep breaths, and the goal is to calm your nervous system. So when you're in shock, your only goal is to treat the shock. You don't want to be doing anything when you're in shock, because when we're in a state of shock, you've got to remember the wrong parts of our brain are activated while the other parts of our brain get turned off. So our frontal lobe, the rational thinking part of our brain, is not on. The hyper aroused reptilian brain is, and we're looking for safety. So shock and trauma are integral in this understanding of the triangle, because if we don't treat both of those, then we're missing a big element of it. Another way to treat shock is getting really good at recognizing your particular symptoms of shock. I can recognize mine because I go into sympathetic as well as parasympathetic shock. I'll get all zenned out and just look like I'm really calm, but I'm really not here. Or it can be where I'm explaining myself or defending myself or talking really fast, or, and that's when I go, okay, I'm in shock. So we want to be able to treat our shock, because we can't work our way off of the triangle if we're in a very activated state of mind. I hope that makes some sense. So treating the shock. Ice, heat is another one. Taking baths. I have this thing called a Belly Buddy that is something that you can put in the microwave and you can heat up, and you put it on your stomach. Heat and cold help to get you back into your body. And the goal is to come back into your body, doing different types of deep breathing. And if you practice yoga, you probably know some different pranayama techniques. A great one is called Nadi Shodhana, where it's breathing through and increasing the communication between the right and the left hemisphere of your brain. So there's a lot of different breathing techniques that can help with that. But I have clients that will just start to say, I'm in shock. Like, okay, I'm recognizing I'm in shock. I'm in shock. So treat the shock. So when you're in shock, the goal is treat the shock, get your nervous system calmed down so that you can think now more rationally. Then returning to our victim triangle, here we go, right? When we are now no longer in a state of shock, we want to start understanding how we enter into the triangle. So I'm going to hold this up a little bit. And everybody has, what I've learned in working with the triangle is that we all have an entry point, and I think we all have a landing point. And an entry point is the place where we come in that is the most natural for us. So for me, and I'm going to talk about myself, my entry point tended to be in the place of the rescuer. Growing up in my family, when things would get really crazy or chaotic, and I had a father that was dying and all this stuff that was going on, I just kind of went into the, what can I do? How can I help my mom? How can I take care of my dad? How can I help my brother? And so I became a rescuer at a very young age. So for the rescuer, you know, we're not in touch with our own feelings because we're too busy trying to fix and take care of everybody else's. It's also a way that we self-soothe, right? Because if we can take care of everyone else, then it kind of eases some of our anxiety. So you want to know, what is your entry point? Some people enter into the perpetrator. You know, what sets them off is when they start getting really angry at someone. That person isn't driving right. They're not doing the right thing. The victim, I'm helpless, I don't know what to do. That would be another entry point for me. It would be in the victim role. So we'll have an entry point where we often tend to enter, as well as our landing point. You know, it's like the place where we kind of default to. I mentioned in a previous video that I tended to land either in the victim or the rescuer. And remember that they're all victim energy, right? Even if you're in the persecutor role, it's all victim energy. But it's, where does your home base seem to be? And you want to get familiar with that so that you can start to identify what those behaviors and feelings are. So I'll give you an example of something that happened yesterday for me, and this would have been something that would have sent me onto the triangle for sure. I went to yoga, and you know, when you start moving your body and you start connecting, you know, your breath and your body and movement, you start feeling things, right? Our emotions get stored in our body. And yoga has not been the easiest thing for me to practice since the fire. I've got a lot of scar tissue in my foot, and it gets really uncomfortable. And so I got onto my mat, and I was doing the class, and I not only felt really sore and stiff, so I physically could feel a lot of stiffness in my body, but as I was moving, I was feeling a lot of different emotions. Then they were just coming up. There was no story to them. There was nothing that had happened. You know, there's nothing going on in my life that would even bring these about. But the next thing I knew, I was feeling a lot of sadness, a lot of grief, and pain, and a lot of hurt. And in the past, when I would feel those feelings, I would immediately go into rescue mode. That would be my invitation or my entry point onto the victim triangle. What do I need to do? What do I need to fix? What can I do in this situation? You know, oftentimes I would say to my therapist, you know, what should I do? What should I do? What should I do? And she would just keep looking at me and say, there's nothing for you to do. And I still do that. Sometimes I say, but what am I supposed to do, right? Because we're so conditioned that that's how we learn how to be in the world. So as I'm leaving yoga and I'm feeling all of these different emotions, and I'm crying, and I can just feel this, I don't even really know what it's all about. I can just feel it in my body, and it's being released. And because I'm doing this series on the victim triangle, I'm driving in my car, and I thought, no wonder I went into rescue mode, because I didn't like those feelings. Sitting with those feelings like I did yesterday, it's hard, it's painful, it's uncomfortable. But that's how I stay off of the victim triangle, is by staying with my feelings. And we're going to talk in the next video of how do you get off the triangle, how do you stay off of the triangle, and how do you recognize when you're interacting with other people that are on the triangle, and what to do about that, because that's real important too. So we want to know, what is our entry point? Where do we tend to oftentimes land? Another place that I would land would be in the victim role. And it would be in the sense of, I can't do anything about this situation. I feel powerless. I think Sophie's having some little puppy dreams. Feeling powerless, just scared, right? So that's victim energy. That would be another place that I would land. So we want to get familiar with our particular way of being on the triangle. What's our entry point? What's our landing point? And what does that behavior look like within us, right? Awareness is the goal, because when we become aware, we begin to empower ourselves to make some real powerful changes. So we want to look at, where do we enter? Okay, where is our entry point, and what happens? What does our particular behavior look like? So, like, some people, when they get into the persecutor role, they get really aggressive, really mean, really. Some people get really passive, right? Their MO is to get passive. We want to know, what does our behavior look like when we're in that space? When I'm in the persecutor role, it's the, I know better. I have this figured out. I know what I'm doing, So when we start knowing ourselves enough to know, oh, that's what I do when I'm in the rescuer mode. That's what that looks like in the victim role. That's what we're going for, is getting familiar with our particular experience and how that manifests in our life, right? And remembering, this is about the connection to power. What does our connection to power feel like in this moment? So for me, in the rescue mode, if I was feeling really bad, one of the ways that I could feel more empowered was to start caretaking for other people, right? It's like a false sense of power, but nevertheless, it felt like power. The persecutor role, I think, is one of the most powerful roles on the triangle, because people feel really strong when they're lashing out at other people. It feels like, there's their anger and there's energy there. So when we're looking at this whole victim triangle and we're trying to figure out, what is my role, what does my behavior look like, we're really doing that self-reflection on, what do I do in this place? What does my victim look like? And how can I get so familiar with that I can recognize it quickly, so that I can learn to take the steps to get off, right? So remember, a couple things before we wrap up, is learning to treat your shock response. And chances are, if you had a lot of trauma in your background and the triangulation and all of this kind of stuff going on, there was a lot of shock happening too. And so we all know what the feeling is of being at peace, right? Maybe we've been at the beach and we just feel that peaceful feeling, or it's in a forest, or it's hiking in the mountains. You want to know how to connect to that inner peace, because that's when our nervous system is calmed down, our brain can function fully on all its pistons. We're not in fight, flight, or freeze, or thinking that a dinosaur is chasing us. And then we can start to have awareness and insight into what's going on in our life. So I hope that is helpful for you guys. I'm trying to think of if there's anything else I want to add to this. I initially, last week, I had written out, kind of everything that I wanted to say, and I found that when I was doing that, I almost was relying more on my book, as opposed to just knowing I have all this information within me. I want to share this and get this out to you, and that's what I want to do. So, victim triangle, where are you at on it? And what roles do you tend to occupy? Do you know what your behavior looks like when you get into those roles, right? Like, I can recognize my rescue and my victim and my perpetrator like lickety split. But again, that's doing the work on the triangle. That's how we get off of it, is when we get so familiar with what our behavior looks like when we are on the triangle. That's when we can say to ourselves, okay, so now I need to start doing the process of how to get off. But we've got to know what we look like when we're on the triangle. So I send you much love and many well wishes. And I hope you subscribe to this channel, share this, comment, tell me what's helpful, share with me if you'd like me to speak on more things and elaborate more. I would love to do that. I want this to be a place that you come to gain some insight and some understanding into who you are and how you can show up as your best self. I think that this is really my mantra and my tagline. It's like, when we heal ourselves, we show up in the world as a different person. And the more we heal within ourselves, the parts of ourselves that have been wounded, or the ones that we've wounded ourselves, we become the best versions of ourselves, and we have more to offer to everyone in our lives, to society, everywhere. And it shows up in just little ways. I was coming into my house yesterday, and as I was entering, and I just had the locks replaced. They, broke after some years, and it wasn't working. And I was walking in. I had the dog walking out. I had groceries in my hand. I had so much going on, and I'm trying to call the locksmith, and I was kind of short with the woman on the phone. And I knew it at the time, and I couldn't manage all of what I was doing, and I probably should have just done one thing at a time. But I immediately, after I got off the phone and they scheduled a time to come back, I called them back and I said, I'm so sorry. I was a little bit short and I didn't mean to. And it's really a nice place to be, where we can have at least that awareness of, yeah, I'm human, and I can make mistakes, and I can, maybe be impatient at times, but I can really quickly recognize that and fix it, and just be the best self that I can be. All right, so I bid you guys so much love, and look forward to connecting with you next week. Aho.